Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we follow the story of a man unlike any other, a craftsman, a dreamer, and a wanderer who built his faith out of wood and wind. His name was Floki, and some called him mad. But within his madness lived the spark that carried the Vikings beyond the world they knew. In the 9th century, when the world was still wrapped in mystery and the edges of maps dissolved into legend, the Norse people looked out across the dark waters of the North Atlantic and wondered what lay beyond. They were farmers and warriors, traders and raiders, people who had learned to survive in a land where winter could kill as easily as any sword. Yet within their cold kingdoms, there existed men and women who dreamed of more than survival. They dreamed of discovery, of lands unseen, of answers whispered by the gods themselves. Floki Vilgadarsson was one such man. His name has echoed through the centuries, carried on the wind that fills the sails of every ship, remembered in the sagas that were sung by firelight in longhouses now long turned to dust. He was a shipbuilder whose vessels were said to move like living things across the water. He was a mystic who heard voices in the creak of timber and saw omens in the flight of ravens. He was a friend to kings and a stranger to himself, a man whose genius and whose torment were woven so tightly together that none could say where one ended and the other began. The story of Floki is not a simple tale of heroism or conquest. It is a story of obsession and vision, of friendship and betrayal, of the terrible beauty that comes when a human mind touches something greater than itself and is forever changed. It is a story that begins in the smoky workshops of Kattegat, where wood shavings curled like waves and the smell of pine resin hung heavy in the air, and ends in the volcanic silence of Iceland, where a man stood alone beneath a sky that stretched to infinity. To understand Floki, we must first understand the world that shaped him. The Scandinavia of the Viking Age was a place of stark contrasts. Long summer days, when the sun barely dipped below the horizon, gave way to winters of endless night, when families huddled together for warmth and told stories to keep the darkness at bay. The land itself was beautiful and brutal, a tapestry of fjords and forests, mountains and moorlands, where the sea was both highway and grave. The Norse people believed the world was alive with spirits and gods, that every tree and stone, every stream and storm held power and meaning. They worshipped Odin, the one-eyed wanderer who traded his eye for wisdom, and Thor, whose hammer kept the forces of chaos at bay. They honored Freya, goddess of love and war, and Loki, the trickster whose cunning brought both innovation and disaster. These were not distant, untouchable deities, but beings who walked among mortals, who meddled in human affairs, who demanded respect and sacrifice. In this world of gods and men, the ship was sacred. It was more than mere transportation. It was freedom itself, the means by which the Norse could reach beyond their cold shores and touch distant lands. A well-built ship could carry warriors to England or traders to Byzantium. It could bring home silver and silk, stories and slaves. And for some, like Floki, a ship was something more still, a bridge between the mortal world and the divine, a vessel not just for men, but for dreams. Floki's ships were different from all others. Those who sailed in them spoke of how they seemed to understand the sea, how they rode the waves as if guided by invisible hands. His longships were sleek and swift, with elegant curves that caught the wind perfectly, and keels that cut through water like a blade through silk. But it was not just their beauty or their speed that made them remarkable. It was the spirit with which they were built. Floki worked alone, often through the night, by the light of tallow candles that cast long shadows across his workshop. He would run his hands over every plank, feeling for imperfections invisible to the eye. He would listen to the wood, or so he claimed, pressing his ear against the grain and hearing its story, its strength, its willingness to bend or break. He carved runes into hidden places, symbols of protection and power, prayers to the gods scratched into wood that would never see sunlight. People said Floki spoke to the ships as he built them. They said he sang to the timber and whispered secrets to the nails. They said he was touched by the gods, blessed with knowledge that ordinary men could not possess. Others said he was simply mad, his mind unbalanced by too many hours alone with his work, his thoughts twisted by visions that came unbidden in the dark. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps genius and madness are not opposites, but twins, two faces of the same force that drives certain individuals beyond the boundaries of the ordinary. Floki lived on that boundary, walked that thin line between inspiration and obsession, between wisdom and delusion. And in walking it, he would change the course of history, open new worlds, and pay a price that no amount of fame or glory could ever repay. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and the day's demands fade into memory, we will travel back through the mist of centuries to walk beside this strange and solitary man. We will see through his eyes the forests where he found his timber, the beaches where he tested his vessels, the storms that nearly claimed his life. We will stand with him on the deck of a ship sailing into the unknown, watch with him as new land rises from the sea, and follow him into the terrible solitude that awaited at the end of his journey. This is the story of Floki, the mad genius of the north. It is a story of wood and water, of faith and doubt, of the restless human spirit that can never be content with the world as it is, but must always reach beyond, toward something greater, something just out of reach. It is a story that begins long ago, in a time when the world was young, and the north was a place of wonders. Let us begin. The settlement of Kattegat sat where the land met the sea, a collection of longhouses and workshops clustered around a natural harbour. Smoke rose from hearth fires in lazy spirals, carrying the scent of cooking fish and burning peat across the water. Fishing boats bobbed at anchor, their hulls dark against the silver morning light, and on the beach men worked on repairs, their hammers ringing out in steady rhythm. This was a place built by practical people, farmers and fishermen who understood that survival meant hard work and careful planning, who had little patience for dreamers or fools. Floki was born into this world, though from the beginning it was clear he would never quite fit into it. His father was a shipbuilder of modest skill, a man who made sturdy vessels that served their purpose well enough, but held no particular magic. His mother was a quiet woman who tended the household and rarely spoke of the visions that sometimes came to her in dreams. From both of them, Floki inherited gifts and burdens that would shape his entire life. As a boy, Floki was strange. While other children played at being warriors, clashing wooden swords and shouting challenges, he would disappear for hours into the forest, returning with his hands full of odd things, bird feathers and smooth stones, twisted roots that looked like sleeping creatures. He would sit by the harbour and watch the boats with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable, his pale eyes tracking every detail of sail and rigging, his lips moving silently as if speaking to someone no one else could see. The other children mocked him, called him Floki the Mad, even then, though there was no real malice in it at first. He was simply different, marked by something they could not name, and children are quick to notice such differences. Floki did not seem to mind. He lived half in his own world, a place of symbols and meanings that only he could perceive, where the shape of a cloud might be an omen and the cry of a gull might carry a message from the gods. His talent revealed itself early. At an age when most boys were still learning to handle basic tools, Floki was carving intricate designs into scraps of wood, creating small boats that floated with perfect balance on the fjord's calm waters. His hands seemed to know what they were doing without being told, moving with a sureness and grace that suggested something beyond mere skill. His father watched with a mixture of pride and unease, recognizing that his son possessed an ability far beyond his own, but uncertain what such gifts might cost. By the time Floki reached his teenage years, he was already working in his father's workshop, though increasingly he worked alone, following designs that existed only in his mind. He would spend days selecting a single piece of timber, rejecting dozens until he found the one that felt right, that spoke to him in whatever silent language wood and spirit shared. He developed methods no one else used, bending planks with steam and pressure, in ways that created curves of startling elegance, fitting joints so precisely that they needed no nails, only wooden pegs and faith. The ships he helped build began to gain a reputation. They were faster than others, more responsive to the helmsman's touch, able to navigate shallow waters where other vessels would run aground. Traders who commissioned boats from Floki's father would specify that the boy must do the work, would pay extra to ensure his involvement. And gradually, as his father aged and his own hands grew stiff with arthritis, it was Floki's name that became known. Floki's designs that set the standard. But reputation brought its own problems. The other shipbuilders of Kattegat grew jealous and suspicious. They whispered that Floki used sorcery, that he made dark pacts to give his vessels unnatural abilities. When a ship he built survived a storm that sank 3 others, they said he had sacrificed to the sea gods, bought safety with blood. When one of his boats was stolen and the thief drowned before reaching shore, they said the ship itself had taken vengeance, that Floki's vessels were not quite tame, not entirely under human control. Floki heard the whispers, but did not defend himself. Perhaps he saw no point in arguing with those who would never understand. Perhaps, in his own strange way, he believed some of what they said, believed that he was indeed touched by something beyond the ordinary, that the gods did speak through him, that his ships were more than wood and iron. He grew more isolated, more eccentric, spending entire nights in his workshop, emerging at dawn with wild hair and ash-smudged face, his eyes bright with visions or exhaustion or both. It was during this time that he met Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar was different from the other young men of Kattegat, where they were content to follow tradition, to farm the same fields their fathers had farmed, and dream small, practical dreams. Ragnar looked beyond the horizon. He talked of sailing west, of finding new lands that the sagas spoke of in whispers, of winning glory and riches that would make his name immortal. Most dismissed him as a dreamer or a fool, but Floki recognized in Ragnar something he had never found in anyone else: a kindred spirit, a soul equally touched by restlessness and vision. Their friendship formed quickly, bound by shared dreams and mutual recognition. Ragnar saw in Floki not a madman, but a genius, someone whose strange insights and unconventional methods produced results that spoke for themselves. Floki saw in Ragnar not just another ambitious warrior, but someone who understood that the world was larger than Kattegat, that there were mysteries worth pursuing even at great risk, that some dreams were worth the cost of everything. They would sit together on the cliffs above the harbour, watching the sun set over the western sea, talking for hours about what might lie beyond the waves. Ragnar spoke of his ambitions, his hunger for fame and adventure, his conviction that the gods had marked him for great things. Floki spoke more rarely, but more strangely, in fragments and riddles, about signs he had seen and voices he had heard, about the way the world was put together and the hidden patterns that connected all things. To others, their friendship seemed odd, unlikely. Ragnar was charismatic and bold, a natural leader who drew people to him with easy charm and infectious confidence. Floki was awkward and intense, prone to long silences and sudden, disconcerting laughter, more comfortable with wood and tools than with people. Yet between them was a bond that went deeper than surface differences, a recognition that each possessed something the other lacked, that together they might achieve things neither could accomplish alone. When Ragnar began seriously planning his first voyage westward, it was to Floki he turned. "Build me a ship," Ragnar said. "Build me a ship that can sail beyond the world we know, that can take me to England and bring me home again. Build me a ship worthy of legend." Floki accepted without hesitation. For him, this was more than a commission, more than simply another vessel to construct. This was his chance to create something truly extraordinary, to pour all his skill and vision into a single work, to build not just a ship, but a gateway to destiny. He retreated to his workshop and began. For months he worked with an intensity that frightened even those who knew him. He ate little and slept less, driven by a vision that consumed him entirely. He selected each piece of timber with infinite care, rejected dozens of perfectly good planks in search of something beyond perfection. He carved protective symbols into hidden places, whispered prayers and promises to gods whose names he barely knew how to speak. He pushed himself and his materials to their limits, experimenting with new techniques, taking risks that more cautious builders would never dare. The result was a masterpiece, The ship that emerged from Floki's workshop was unlike anything Kattegat had seen before. Long and lean, with a dragon's head carved at the prow and a sail striped in red and white, it sat in the water as if eager to be away, as if impatient with the land and hungry for the sea. When Ragnar first saw it, he stood silent for a long moment, and then he smiled, and Floki knew that he had succeeded, that he had created something worthy of the dreams they shared. They launched on a clear morning when the wind was steady and the omens favorable. The whole settlement turned out to watch, some cheering, others silent with doubt or envy. Floki stood on the beach as the ship pulled away from shore, watching his creation ride the waves, seeing it move with the grace and power he had imagined in his long nights of solitary work. And as the vessel grew smaller in the distance, he felt something shift inside him, a sense that his life had changed, that he had crossed a threshold from which there would be no returning. Ragnar's voyage was successful. He returned with treasure and tales, with proof that the West could be reached and conquered, that the old songs spoke truth. And with that success came fame for both of them, for the warrior who had dared the journey, and for the shipbuilder who had made it possible. Floki's name spread beyond Kattegat, carried on the wind, sung in verses, spoken with respect and wariness in equal measure. But fame did not bring Floki peace. If anything, it deepened his strangeness, intensified the visions that came to him with increasing frequency. He began to speak more often of the gods, to insist that they guided his hands, that his designs came not from his own mind, but from divine inspiration. He would interrupt conversations to point at the sky, claiming to see signs invisible to others, or stop suddenly in his work to listen to sounds no one else could hear. People whispered that success had driven him mad, that the gods he claimed to serve were tormenting him rather than blessing him. Yet still, they came to him when they needed ships. Still they sought his skills, even as they feared his strangeness. And Floki continued to build, continued to create vessels of surpassing beauty and power, driven by forces he could not name and could not resist. The workshop where Floki created his vessels was a sacred space, though none would have called it that. It stood at the edge of the settlement, half hidden by a stand of pines that whispered secrets in the northern wind. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of fresh-cut wood and wood oil, of tar and rope, and the metallic tang of iron. Tools hung from the walls in careful arrangement, each in its place, each worn smooth by years of use. This was where Floki's genius lived, in the quiet hours before dawn and the long twilights of summer, in the space between thought and action, where ideas became reality. Shipbuilding in the Viking Age was not a solitary art. Typically, it required many hands working together, each person contributing their particular skill to the collective effort. But Floki worked differently. He would accept help for the heavy labor, the felling of trees, and the transport of timber. But the essential work, the shaping and fitting and joining, he insisted on doing himself. He could not explain why this had to be so, but he felt it deeply, knew that each vessel must carry the imprint of a single vision, must be made whole by one set of hands, one mind, one spirit. The process began in the forest. Floki would wander for days among the tall pines and ancient oaks, searching for trees that spoke to him. He looked for timber with the right grain, the right density, the right age and character. A ship was not merely a floating platform, but a living synthesis of many elements, each piece chosen not just for its structural properties, but for qualities more difficult to name. Some trees were too rigid, would crack under stress rather than flexing. Others were too soft, would rot quickly in salt water. The best timber had resilience, a quality of strength combined with flexibility, an ability to yield without breaking. When Floki found a suitable tree, he would place his hand on its trunk and stand in silence for long minutes, as if listening or asking permission. Then he would make his first cut, a clean stroke with his axe that sent chips flying and filled the air with the sharp scent of fresh sap. The felling of a tree was dangerous work, requiring careful judgment about which way it would fall, but Floki seemed to know instinctively, seemed to read the tree's weight and balance without conscious calculation. Once the timber was back at his workshop, the real work began. Using an axe and an adze, he would rough out the basic shape, removing bark and sapwood, following the natural curves of the grain. This was brutal, exhausting labor that left his hands blistered and his back aching. But Floki approached it with a patience that bordered on reverence. He never rushed, never forced the wood to conform to his will, but worked with it, finding the shape that already existed within and revealing it stroke by stroke. The keel was the spine of the ship, the single most important piece, and Floki chose it with extraordinary care. It had to be long and straight, cut from a tree that had grown tall without major branches, strong enough to bear the weight of the entire vessel, yet flexible enough to ride the waves. Once shaped, the keel was laid on the beach, and from it, like ribs from a backbone, the rest of the ship would grow. The strakes, the overlapping planks that formed the hull, were split from logs using wedges, creating boards that followed the grain perfectly and thus possessed maximum strength. Each strake was shaped individually, tapered at the ends, curved to fit the overall design. Floki would bend them using steam, heating water in a large trough and holding the wood over the vapor until it became pliable, then clamping it into position and letting it dry, imprinting the curve into its memory. The fitting of the strakes was an art form in itself. They overlapped like scales on a dragon, each one fastened to the one below with iron rivets, the joints sealed with tarred rope to keep water out. The pattern of overlap determined not just the waterproofness, but the flexibility of the entire hull. Too tight, and the ship would be rigid, unable to twist and flex with the waves. Too loose, and it would leak and eventually come apart. Floki knew the balance instinctively, adjusted each joint by feel rather than measurement, trusting his hands and his judgment in ways that more conventional builders found incomprehensible. The ribs or frames were added after the hull was planked, a technique that gave Norse ships their characteristic flexibility. The frames were not structural in the way they were in other shipbuilding traditions, but rather helped maintain the hull's shape and provided attachment points for the deck and internal fittings. Floki carved each one individually, fitting them snugly against the curves of the strakes, lashing them in place with cord made from roots, a material that swelled when wet and created a grip tighter than any nail. As the ship took shape, Floki would walk around it at all hours, studying it from every angle, his eyes tracking lines invisible to others. He would place his hands on the hull, feeling for irregularities, for places where the wood felt wrong or the curve was not quite true. Sometimes he would order changes that made no sense to anyone watching, insisting that a particular plank be removed and replaced, that a frame be shifted by a finger's width, adjustments so small they seemed meaningless, yet which he insisted were essential. The mast was another critical element, a single tall pine carefully selected and shaped. It had to be straight and strong, but also flexible, able to bend in high winds without snapping. Floki would work the mast himself, shaping it with drawknife and plane until it was perfectly round, perfectly balanced. At its base he carved a fish, a symbol of good fortune and safe passage. At its top he left the wood rough, believing the gods preferred to see natural texture rather than human presumption. The sail was not Floki's work, that was women's labour, the weaving and stitching of wool into vast rectangles that would catch the wind and pull the ship forward. But he supervised the process closely, specified the weight of the cloth and the pattern of reinforcement, insisted on particular colours for reasons he never fully explained. Red and white, he would say, or sometimes blue and yellow, claiming that certain combinations pleased the gods of sea and sky. That colour mattered in ways beyond mere appearance. The rudder, mounted on the right side near the stern, was carved with particular care. It was a long oar-like blade that extended deep into the water, controlled by a tiller that ran across the deck. Floki shaped it to produce just the right amount of resistance, enough to give the helmsman control, but not so much that it slowed the ship. He decorated it with carvings, serpents and spirals, patterns that seemed abstract, but which held meaning for him. References to stories and concepts he rarely shared. Finally came the figurehead. Every Viking ship had one, a carved image mounted at the prow, typically a dragon or serpent, meant to frighten enemies and protect the vessel from malevolent spirits. Floki carved his figureheads with intense concentration, working late into the night by firelight, the shadows dancing across features that emerged from the wood with startling life. His dragons had eyes that seemed to see, mouths open in silent roars, expressions of ferocity tempered with intelligence. These were not mere decorations, but guardians, spirits bound into wood, or so Floki believed. When a ship was complete, Floki performed a ritual that was his alone, something he had never learned from his father or any other teacher. He would wait for a night when the moon was dark, would take a knife and prick his thumb, letting 3 drops of blood fall onto the deck. Then he would walk the entire length of the vessel, from stem to stern, speaking words in a language that might have been Old Norse or might have been something else entirely, something older and stranger. Those who witnessed these rituals found them unsettling, but did not dare interfere. The ships that emerged from Floki's workshop were too valuable, too successful, to risk offending whatever powers guided his strange practices. The vessels Floki built were more than transportation. They were expressions of a world view, a philosophy about humanity's relationship with nature and the divine. Every curve and joint, every carved symbol, and carefully selected timber reflected his belief that the world was alive, that matter and spirit were not separate but woven together, that a ship built with proper understanding and respect would carry not just men, but their hopes and dreams, would become a bridge between the known and the unknown, between earth and heaven. His ships were fast. They could outrun storms and catch winds that other vessels missed. They were stable in rough seas, riding over waves rather than ploughing through them. They were maneuverable, could turn quickly, could navigate shallow rivers and coastal waters that larger ships couldn't reach. These qualities were not accidents, but results of countless small decisions, details that seemed insignificant individually, but which together created something greater than the sum of their parts. Sailors who crewed Floki's ships spoke of them with a mixture of pride and unease. They said the vessels seemed to have their own will, would respond to danger before the crew was aware of it, would find safe passage through storms as if guided by invisible hands. Some claimed to hear voices in the creak of the ribs and the whisper of wind through the rigging. Not words exactly, but something like them, presences that travelled with the ship and watched over its crew. Whether these stories were true or merely the result of fear and imagination mixed with genuine excellence of design, none could say for certain. What was undeniable was that Floki's ships succeeded where others failed, that they opened new possibilities for exploration and conquest, that they changed what the Norse people believed was possible. And with each launching, with each vessel that slipped into the water and caught the wind, Floki's legend grew, and so did the strangeness that surrounded him. He built ships for many men, but it was always for Ragnar that he saved his greatest efforts. Each vessel he created for his friend was an improvement on the last, a step forward in design and capability. He built Ragnar the ships that carried him to England, that brought him wealth and fame. He built the vessels that raided Paris, that sailed up rivers deep into foreign lands, that made Ragnar's name known from Scandinavia to Byzantium. And with each ship, Floki poured not just his skill, but something of himself, gave a piece of his spirit to the wood and iron, bound his fate to Ragnar's in ways that went beyond friendship, beyond any normal human connection. The ships were his gift and his chain, his art and his prison. Through them he touched greatness, but through them too he walked toward a destiny that would demand everything and give back only questions without answers, visions without peace. The gods of the North were not distant or abstract. They were present, active, involved in the world of men in ways both subtle and dramatic. They appeared in dreams and visions, spoke through omens and signs, demanded sacrifice and rewarded faith. The Norse understood that the divine and mortal realms touched constantly, that the boundaries between them were thin and permeable, that a person who listened carefully might hear the voices of powers beyond human understanding. Floki heard those voices more clearly than most, or perhaps he only believed he did, his mind interpreting natural phenomena as divine communication, reading meaning into random events, constructing a spiritual reality that existed only in his perception. The line between mystic and madman has always been difficult to draw, and in Floki's case, it may be impossible. What matters is not whether the gods truly spoke to him, but that he believed they did, that this belief shaped every aspect of his life, drove every decision, colored every experience. The visions began in his youth, but intensified as he grew older, as his reputation and isolation both increased. They would come without warning, sometimes in the middle of a conversation or while he was working. His eyes would lose focus, his face would go blank, and he would stand motionless for long seconds or minutes, seeing things no one else could see, hearing words in languages no one else could understand. When he returned to himself, he would often laugh, that strange high-pitched laugh that made people uncomfortable, or he would speak in riddles, in fragments that seemed meaningless, but which he insisted held profound truths. He saw the gods everywhere. In the flight of ravens, those blackbirds sacred to Odin, he read messages about the future. In the patterns of foam on waves, he found symbols of cosmic significance. In the grain of wood, he discovered maps to hidden realms. The world, for Floki, was a text written in divine language, and his gift and his curse was the ability to read it, or at least the conviction that he could. Odin fascinated him particularly. The All-Father, the one-eyed wanderer, god of wisdom and poetry, war and death, magic and prophecy. Odin had sacrificed his eye for knowledge, had hung himself from the world tree for 9 days and nights to learn the secrets of the runes. He was a god of paradoxes, terrible and generous, wise and treacherous, who understood that all knowledge came at a cost, that enlightenment and suffering were inseparable. Floki saw in Odin a reflection of his own divided nature, his own willingness to pay any price for understanding, his own acceptance that genius and torment were 2 sides of the same coin. He began to make offerings, not in the public ceremonies where the whole community gathered to sacrifice animals and share meat, but privately, in places he went alone. He would climb to high cliffs where the wind howled like the voices of spirits, and leave gifts for the gods, carved figures, precious tools, things that cost him to give up. He would stand with arms outstretched, speaking prayers or challenges, or simply waiting in silence for answers that might never come. Sometimes in the depths of winter, when the darkness was nearly absolute and the cold bit through every layer of clothing, he would fast for days, believing that hunger and discomfort would open his mind to divine communication. He would sit by the shore, wrapped in furs, watching the northern lights dance across the sky, those sheets of green and violet that seemed to reveal glimpses of other worlds. In those lights, he claimed to see the Valkyries riding, see the halls of Valhalla, see the faces of gods looking down at the mortal realm with interest or amusement or contempt. The other people of Kattegat didn't know what to make of his spiritual intensity. Most Norse practiced their religion with practical devotion, offering sacrifices before voyages or battles, honoring the gods at appointed times, but not letting faith consume their entire existence. They had crops to tend and families to feed, concrete responsibilities that demanded attention. Floki's obsession seemed excessive, even dangerous, a sign that he had lost the balance that healthy people maintained between the sacred and the mundane. Yet they could not entirely dismiss him either, because his prophecies sometimes came true. He would predict storms that arrived exactly as he said they would. He would warn against certain voyages, and those who ignored him would meet with misfortune. He would speak of distant events, wars or deaths, or the rise of new leaders, and weeks later, travelers would arrive with news that confirmed what he had said. These successes might have been coincidence, might have been the result of a keen observer's ability to read weather patterns and political currents. But they might also have been genuine insight, genuine connection to powers beyond normal human perception. Ragnar took Floki's visions seriously, though with a pragmatic perspective. He did not necessarily believe that the gods spoke to his friend, but he recognized that Floki's instincts were often correct, that his strange perspectives sometimes revealed truths that more conventional thinking missed. When Floki advised him about timing or direction or alliances, Ragnar listened, weighed the advice against other considerations, and often chose to follow it, finding that doing so led to success more often than not. But the visions took their toll. Each one left Floki exhausted, drained of energy and color, as if something essential had been temporarily removed from him. He would emerge from them trembling, sometimes weeping, sometimes laughing, but always changed, marked by contact with something that human minds were not meant to touch directly. The accumulation of these experiences wore at him, ground down his mental and emotional stability, left him more fragile and volatile with each passing year. He began to speak more openly about his communication with the divine, no longer hiding or minimizing it, but declaring it proudly, insisting that he was chosen, that the gods had marked him for a special purpose. He talked about messages he had received, tasks he was meant to perform, journeys he was destined to make. Some of what he said made a kind of sense, vague prophecies about exploration and discovery that aligned with Ragnar's ambitions. Other statements were obscure or contradictory, riddles without solutions, declarations that seemed to mean nothing and might mean everything. The spiritual path Floki walked was lonely. Even those who believed in his gifts could not truly understand what he experienced, could not share the visions or ease the burden they imposed. He was isolated within his own mind, trapped with perceptions that separated him from normal human connection. He tried to explain, would grab people by the shoulders and speak urgently about what he had seen, but the words always failed, could not bridge the gap between his experience and their comprehension. This isolation drove him deeper into his craft. The ships became not just work, but meditation, not just construction, but prayer. Every stroke of the axe, every adjustment of a joint was an offering to the gods, a conversation carried out in wood and iron. When he was building, he felt closest to the divine, felt that his hands were guided, that he was serving a purpose larger than himself. The workshop became his temple, the tools his sacred implements, the finished vessels his hymns carved in physical form. Yet even in his devotion, doubt crept in. In his darkest moments, alone in the night, he wondered if he was simply mad, if the voices he heard were only his own thoughts reflected back in distorted form, if his visions were nothing but the products of a mind unbalanced by stress and isolation. These doubts terrified him more than any storm or battle could, because if they were true, then his entire life was built on delusion. Then the meaning he had constructed was just elaborate fantasy. Then the gods whose voices he heard so clearly did not speak at all, but merely echoed his own desperate need to believe in something greater than himself. But always, before the doubt could consume him entirely, something would happen. A prophecy would prove true. A ship would perform beyond all reasonable expectation. A raven would appear at exactly the right moment, and he would take these as confirmation, as proof that he was not mad, that the gods were real, that his path, however difficult, was the one he was meant to walk. The tension between faith and doubt, between divine calling and human limitation, defined Floki's inner life. He lived on that edge, balanced between transcendence and breakdown, never quite falling into either, but never finding rest in stable certainty. It was a terrible way to live, exhausting and painful, but it was also, in its way, magnificent, a testament to the human capacity to reach beyond the given, to refuse to accept the world as merely material and meaningless, to insist that there must be more, must be purpose, must be gods who care and communicate and guide. This was Floki's true genius, not just his skill with ships, but his absolute commitment to a reality larger than facts and figures, his willingness to sacrifice comfort and sanity for the possibility of touching something divine. Whether he succeeded or merely deluded himself may be less important than the fact that he tried, that he gave everything to the attempt, that he refused to settle for a small, safe, rational life when mystery and wonder called to him from beyond the edges of the known world. The raids began in earnest when Floki's ships proved their worth. Ragnar had always been ambitious, but ambition without means is only fantasy. The vessels Floki built gave Ragnar the tools to transform dreams into reality, to cross the North Sea and strike at the wealthy monasteries and towns of England, bringing back silver and gold, silk and slaves, treasures that made his name feared and respected throughout the Norse world. Floki did not always accompany these raids. He was not a warrior by nature or inclination. Fighting held no appeal for him, and though he could handle weapons if necessary, he lacked the aggressive spirit that made some men effective in battle. His role was the ships themselves, ensuring they were maintained and ready, advising on routes and timing, using his strange instincts to help Ragnar avoid danger and find opportunity. But sometimes he did sail with the raiders, drawn by curiosity about the wider world, by loyalty to Ragnar, and by his own need to see where his creations could go, to test them against the worst the sea could offer. Those voyages were revelations. The North Sea was not the calm fjords of home, but open water stretching to the horizon, where waves could rise higher than a ship's mast and storms could appear with terrifying speed. To navigate such waters required skill and luck and faith, and Floki's vessels proved capable of all three. The first time Floki saw England, he stood at the rail of Ragnar's ship and watched the green coast emerge from morning mist, a land so different from the harsh beauty of Scandinavia that it seemed almost magical. Here were forests without mountains, fields that rolled gently rather than climbing steep hillsides, rivers wide and slow compared to the rushing torrents of home. The people were different too, softer, less hardened by constant struggle, more trusting because they had never faced raiders from across the sea. The monastery they attacked was called Lindisfarne. It sat on an island, accessible at low tide by a causeway that vanished when the water rose. The monks who lived there were scholars and scribes, men who had devoted their lives to God and learning, who possessed little understanding of violence and no preparation for what came that day. Floki watched from the ship as Ragnar and his warriors swept ashore, saw the smoke rise, heard the screams carry across the water. He felt nothing for the victims. Viking ethics did not extend sympathy to strangers or enemies. Those monks were not his people. Their god was not his god, and their suffering was simply the natural result of weakness meeting strength. This was how the world worked, how it had always worked. The strong took from the weak, and those who could not defend what they had did not deserve to keep it. Yet something about the scene troubled him in ways he could not articulate. Perhaps it was the casual brutality, the way men killed with laughter and celebration. Perhaps it was the sight of flames consuming buildings that had stood for generations, destroying knowledge and beauty for the sake of gold. Or perhaps it was simply that the raid felt wrong somehow, that his spiritual senses, so attuned to signs and omens, detected something off balance, some cosmic disturbance that had been created by this act of violence against holy men. Ragnar returned with treasure and triumph, his warriors singing of their prowess. The raid was a success by every practical measure, bringing wealth and proving that England could be conquered, that the old assumptions about distance and safety were false. But Floki remained quiet, unusually subdued, and when Ragnar asked what troubled him, he could not explain, could only say that something felt wrong, that the gods were displeased, though he could not say which gods or why. More raids followed. Each one was easier than the last, because the English were slow to adapt, slow to build defences against this new threat from the north. Ragnar's fame grew with each successful voyage, and with it grew his ambition. He spoke of larger targets, of capturing towns, of establishing permanent settlements in this rich and vulnerable land. And always, it was Floki's ships that made these dreams possible. Floki's craft that carried warriors across the water and brought them home laden with plunder. During these years, Floki and Ragnar's friendship deepened into something beyond simple camaraderie. They became like brothers, bound by shared experiences and mutual dependence. Ragnar needed Floki's ships and his uncanny instincts. Floki needed Ragnar's protection and the purpose that their partnership provided. Each saw in the other something essential, something that made life meaningful in a world that could be harsh and empty. They would sit together on the deck during long voyages, watching stars wheel overhead, talking about philosophy and fate, about the nature of the gods and the meaning of existence. Ragnar was more skeptical than Floki, less convinced that the divine was directly involved in human affairs, but he respected his friend's faith even when he did not share it. And Floki, despite his intensity about spiritual matters, appreciated Ragnar's pragmatism, the way he could balance vision with practicality, dream with execution. Yet even in the best times, there were tensions. Floki's strangeness sometimes embarrassed Ragnar, made it harder to maintain his image as a strong, reliable leader. When Floki would suddenly start laughing at nothing, or stop in mid-conversation to point at the sky and declare he saw omens, or refuse to go ashore because he sensed bad spirits, it undermined the careful reputation Ragnar was building. And Ragnar's increasing fame brought new relationships that Floki viewed with suspicion and jealousy. Particularly when Ragnar befriended a Christian monk named Athelstan. Athelstan was a prisoner from one of the early raids, a young man with intelligence and linguistic talent who had been taken back to Kattegat as a slave. Unlike most captives, he was not sold or killed, but kept by Ragnar, who was fascinated by Christianity and saw in Athelstan an opportunity to learn about this strange religion that had conquered much of Europe. Gradually, Athelstan's status changed from slave to advisor, from prisoner to friend. Floki hated him immediately. He saw in Athelstan a threat not just to his own position as Ragnar's closest confidant, but to the spiritual order of the world. Christianity was a disease, in Floki's view, a poison that weakened people by teaching them to be meek and forgiving, that denied the validity of the old gods and claimed there was only one truth, one path, one way to live. That Ragnar would bring such a person into his inner circle, would listen to his counsel and protect him from those who wanted him dead, seemed a betrayal of everything the Norse held sacred. The conflict between Floki and Athelstan became a wound in Ragnar's household, a constant source of attention that never quite erupted into open violence, but never healed either. Floki would make hostile comments, would refuse to be in the same space as the monk, would perform rituals specifically designed to counter what he saw as Athelstan's corrupting influence. And Athelstan, for his part, tried to reach Floki with kindness and reason, tried to build a bridge between their different faiths, not understanding that for Floki such a bridge was impossible, that his entire identity was built on opposition to what Christianity represented. Ragnar tried to mediate, but could not resolve the fundamental incompatibility. He valued both men, needed both men, but they could not coexist peacefully. The situation strained his friendship with Floki, created distance where once there had been easy intimacy. Floki felt abandoned, betrayed by the one person he had trusted completely. He withdrew further into himself, spent more time alone in his workshop, spoke more frequently of gods and doom, became more erratic and unpredictable. During these years, the visions became darker, more troubling. Floki began to see not just messages from the gods, but omens of disaster, signs that something terrible was coming, that the balance of the world was being disturbed. He tried to warn Ragnar, insisted that Athelstan's presence was bringing down divine wrath, that catastrophe would follow unless the Christian was removed. But Ragnar would not listen, or could not, torn between his old friendship and his new curiosity, between loyalty to his culture and fascination with something different. The tension built slowly, a pressure that could not be released, a storm gathering on a horizon no one else could see. Floki felt it in his bones, in the quality of the light, in the taste of the air. Something was wrong, something was coming. And when it arrived, the world he knew would be changed forever. He was certain of this, with the same certainty he felt when selecting timber for a keel or reading weather in the clouds. The gods were speaking, and what they said was terrible. And no one would listen. The breaking came on a night when rain hammered against the roof of the longhouse and wind howled through gaps in the walls, Inside, fires burned in the hearths, casting dancing shadows across the faces of men and women gathered for warmth and company. There was drinking and laughter, stories being told. The kind of comfortable evening that should have been peaceful, but which felt instead like a calm before something terrible. Floki sat apart from the others, hunched near one of the fires, staring into the flames as if reading messages written in smoke and ember. His hands were wrapped around a horn of mead, but he had barely touched it, his attention focused inward or outward, but certainly not on the celebration around him. Several times people had tried to include him in conversation, but he had responded with only grunts or monosyllables, and eventually they had given up. Let him be alone with his thoughts. Athelstan was there, sitting near Ragnar, participating in the conversation with an ease that would have been impossible years earlier when he first arrived as a terrified prisoner. He had learned Norse fluently, had adapted to the culture while maintaining his own faith, had found a place in this foreign world through intelligence and goodwill. Many of the settlers had come to respect him, value his knowledge and his perspective. But for Floki, his very presence was a wound that never healed, a constant reminder of what he saw as Ragnar's betrayal. What exactly happened next has been debated by historians and storytellers for centuries. The sagas give different accounts, emphasize different details, assign different motives. What is clear is that Floki left the longhouse during the evening, disappeared into the storm, and that shortly after, Athelstan also left, perhaps to relieve himself, perhaps for some other reason, and that the two men met in the darkness. The murder was brutal. Athelstan was struck from behind, given no chance to defend himself, killed by someone who had approached him as a friend, or at least not as an obvious enemy. His body was found the next morning, sprawled in the mud near the edge of the settlement, eyes staring at nothing, the rain having washed away most of the blood, but not the evidence of violence. Ragnar's grief was terrible to witness. He had lost friends to battle, had seen death in countless forms, but this was different. Athelstan had been more than a companion. He had been a window into a different way of thinking, a challenge to assumptions, a person whose very existence had expanded Ragnar's understanding of what was possible. And now he was gone, murdered by someone close, killed by treachery rather than honorable combat. The investigation did not take long. There were no witnesses to the act itself, but the circumstances pointed clearly in one direction. Floki's hostility toward Athelstan was well known. He had been seen leaving the longhouse at the right time, and when questioned, he could not or would not provide a convincing account of where he had been or what he had done. His eyes were wild, his manner defensive and strange, and though he did not confess directly, neither did he deny in any way that carried conviction. Ragnar faced an impossible choice. The evidence suggested his oldest friend had murdered someone under his protection, had violated the sacred bond of hospitality, had committed an act that demanded justice. But Floki was more than a friend. He was the builder of Ragnar's ships, the source of much of his success, a person whose skills and insights could not easily be replaced. And beyond practical considerations, there was genuine love between them. Bonds forged over years, memories that could not simply be erased by one terrible act. The punishment Ragnar imposed was exile, a middle path between execution and forgiveness. Floki was banished from Kattegat, forbidden to return, cut off from the community that had been his home. It was a sentence of isolation, of separation from everything familiar, and in some ways it was worse than death, because it meant Floki would live, but without purpose, without connection, without the context that had given his life meaning. But the punishment included something else, something strange. Ragnar told Floki that if he could find a way to redeem himself, if he could perform some great service or make some important discovery, then perhaps he could return. Perhaps his crime could be overlooked. It was a vague promise, a hope without clear terms, but it gave Floki something to cling to, a reason to keep existing even in exile. Floki accepted the sentence without protest. Perhaps he felt guilt, though he never expressed it clearly. Perhaps he was simply too broken by what had happened to fight back. Or perhaps, in his own twisted logic, he believed that what he had done was necessary, that he had acted on behalf of the gods, that he had removed a threat to the spiritual health of his people, and that his punishment was simply the price one paid for serving higher powers. He left Kattegat on a grey morning, carrying only what he could bear on his back, walking away from the place where he had been born, where he had learned his craft, where he had built the ships that had carried his people to glory. The other settlers watched him go, most in silence, a few calling out insults or curses. No one tried to stop him. No one said goodbye with kindness. He was cast out, marked as a murderer, someone who had broken the most fundamental codes of their society. For weeks, Floki wandered through the wilderness, surviving on what he could hunt or gather, sleeping in the open or in crude shelters he built from branches and moss. He spoke to no one because there was no one to speak to, only the wind and the trees, the birds and the silence. And in that silence his mind began to unravel further, the visions intensifying, the voices growing louder, the boundary between inner and outer reality dissolving. He travelled north, driven by instinct or madness or divine guidance, moving through forests and across mountains, following paths that existed only in his mind. Sometimes he would stop for days in one place, building a small fire and sitting motionless beside it, staring into the flames or at the sky, waiting for signs that never came, or came constantly, depending on one's interpretation. He grew thin, his clothes ragged, his hair and beard wild and matted. Anyone seeing him would have taken him for a vagrant or a hermit, someone utterly lost to the world of men. But in his own understanding, he was not lost. He was seeking. The gods had taken everything from him, had stripped away friends and home and purpose, and surely this was not mere punishment, but preparation, a necessary emptying that would create space for something new. He was being tested, refined, burned down to essence like metal in a forge, and what emerged would be purer, stronger, more truly aligned with divine will. The guilt about Athelstan, when he allowed himself to feel it, was crushing. He had killed a man who had done him no direct harm, had taken a life in anger and fear rather than in honest combat. This was not how a Norse warrior was supposed to behave. There was no honor in what he had done, no glory, only shame, and the knowledge that he had hurt the one person he loved most in all the world. Yet even this guilt was confused by his religious convictions. Athelstan had been a Christian, an agent of a god Floki considered false, a corrupting influence that threatened the spiritual integrity of the Norse people. By killing him, Floki had protected his community from spiritual poison, had served the old gods by removing their enemy. Was that not righteous? Was that not what a true believer should do? These contradictions tormented him. He could not fully embrace either guilt or righteousness, but was caught between them, unable to find peace in either direction. The visions that came during this period were especially dark, full of blood and fire, images of gods turning away in disgust. Or was it approval? He could no longer tell. Everything was confusion and pain, and the only clarity he had was the growing conviction that he needed to do something extraordinary, needed to find or create or discover something that would give meaning to his suffering, that would transform his exile from mere punishment into purposeful journey. And gradually, as the weeks stretched into months, an idea began to form. It came to him in fragments, in dreams and waking visions, in whispers he heard in the wind. There was a land, the old stories said, far to the west, beyond even the settlements in the Faroe Islands, a place where ice and fire met, where the earth was still being born. A few sailors claimed to have seen it from a distance, had spoken of mountains breathing smoke, of coasts shrouded in fog. Most dismissed these as fantasies, sailors' tales told to impress listeners in warm halls. But Floki believed, or perhaps more accurately, he needed to believe, needed there to be a great quest he could undertake, a discovery he could make that would redeem his crime and prove his worth. If such a land existed, and if he could find it, could sail there and return with news of it, then surely Ragnar would forgive him, would see that the gods had guided him all along, that everything that had happened was part of a larger plan. The idea became an obsession. Floki stopped wandering aimlessly and turned his path toward the coast, toward harbors where he might find what he needed. He would build another ship, would undertake one final voyage, would sail beyond the edge of the known world and find what lay beyond. This would be his redemption, his proof, his answer to all the accusations and doubts. This would transform his exile from tragedy into triumph, his crime from sin into necessary sacrifice. In the depths of his pain and isolation, Floki found new purpose. It was a fragile, desperate purpose, built on speculation and faith rather than solid evidence. But it was enough to keep him alive, to give him reason to wake each morning and continue the journey. He was going to find a new land, going to discover what no one else had dared to seek. And in doing so, he would prove that the gods had chosen him, that his visions were real, that all his suffering had meaning. The coast where Floki eventually arrived was remote, a collection of fishing villages and seasonal camps where people lived hard lives wresting survival from the sea. No one knew him here. No one had heard of his reputation as a shipbuilder or his crime as a murderer. He was simply another stranger, marked by weather and hardship, someone who might be useful or might be trouble, to be watched carefully until his nature revealed itself. He had almost nothing. The tools he had carried from Kattegat were worn and damaged. His clothes were barely adequate against the coastal winds. He possessed no silver to trade, no goods to barter. All he had was his knowledge, his skill, and the burning conviction that he had to build one more ship, had to make one more voyage that would somehow make everything right. The locals were suspicious. A man alone, claiming to be a shipbuilder, but looking more like a vagrant, was unusual enough to warrant caution. But Floki still possessed the ability to see wood in ways others could not, could look at a tree and explain its properties, could sketch in the dirt designs that even untrained eyes recognized as elegant and functional. Gradually, reluctantly, some of the villagers agreed to help him, less from belief in his project than from hope that having him build a boat would give him a reason to leave their shores and become someone else's problem. The construction took months. Floki worked with whatever materials he could find or the villagers would spare, timber that was not quite right, iron he had to trade labor for, piece by piece. It was harder than any project he had undertaken before, not because the design was especially complex, but because every aspect was a struggle, every nail required negotiation, every plank came at the cost of dignity and pride. Yet slowly, painfully, the ship took shape. It was smaller than the grand vessels he had built for Ragnar, less beautiful, more practical. But it was sound, built with all the knowledge he possessed, incorporating every lesson learned from decades of experience. This boat would have to carry him farther than any he had ever made, through seas more dangerous than any he had previously sailed. It had to be perfect, or as close to perfect as his limited resources would allow. As he worked, the visions continued, intensified. He would be shaping a plank and suddenly find himself transported elsewhere, seeing landscapes that could not possibly exist, mountains made of ice, taller than any real mountains, valleys filled with steam and colored water, light that bent and danced in ways that defied nature. Were these memories or prophecies, or simply hallucinations? He did not know, could not separate reality from imagination, fact from vision. The villagers watched him with increasing unease. He would stop work to stare at nothing, would laugh at things no one else found amusing, would speak to the air as if holding conversations with invisible companions. They whispered that he was touched by spirits, that his mind had come loose from its moorings, that the ship he was building would never sail because it was being made by madness. Several times they considered driving him away, but each time something stayed their hands. Perhaps the quality of the work he was doing, perhaps fear of what might happen if they angered someone so clearly, marked by forces beyond normal understanding. Floki heard the whispers, but did not care. He knew he was not entirely sane, knew that his mind worked differently from others, that the boundary between himself and the world was thinner than it should be. But he also knew that this had always been the price of his gifts, that the same sensitivity that allowed him to build perfect ships also opened him to visions and voices, that genius and madness were not opposites, but partners, dancing together in his skull. At night, alone by his fire, he would think about Athelstan, about the moment of the murder, about the look in the monk's eyes as he realized what was happening. The memory was sharp and terrible, never fading, a wound that would not heal. He tried to justify what he had done, to construct arguments about religious duty and protection of tradition, but the arguments felt hollow, excuses rather than reasons. He had killed out of jealousy and fear, had murdered someone weaker, had acted from the worst parts of his nature, rather than the best. This knowledge coexisted with his faith. The gods, he believed, had wanted Athelstan dead, had used Floki as their instrument. But the gods did not care about human guilt or human pain. They had their own purposes, their own logic, and mortals who served them should not expect comfort or justification. Floki had done what he had done, and whether it was right or wrong by human standards was irrelevant. What mattered was that he continue, that he complete the task the gods had set for him, that he find the land his visions promised and bring back proof of its existence. The ship was finally finished on a day when clouds hung low and rain fell in sheets that blurred the line between sea and sky. Floki stood looking at what he had created, this vessel that would carry him beyond the known world or carry him to his death. It was not beautiful like his earlier work, lacked the polish and perfection he had once demanded. But it was honest, functional, built with pure purpose, uncontaminated by pride or showmanship. This was a tool, not an artwork, and that felt appropriate for the journey ahead. He needed a crew. A ship could not be sailed alone, not across open ocean, not for days or weeks of continuous travel. He asked among the villagers, but none would join him. They thought his plan was suicide, that sailing west into unknown waters was madness, that he would simply disappear into the vastness and never be seen again. Why would anyone volunteer for such a fate? But eventually he found a few, men who had their own reasons for wanting to leave, who were desperate or curious, or simply willing to take insane risks for the possibility of reward. They were not ideal crew, not skilled sailors or brave warriors, but they could pull oars and follow directions, and that would have to be enough. The provisions were minimal: dried fish and hard bread, water in sealed barrels, nothing extra, nothing comfortable. This was not a pleasure voyage, but a mission, a desperate attempt to reach a destination whose existence was not even confirmed. If they ran out of food before finding land, they would starve. If storms caught them far from shore, they would drown. If the ship failed in any of 1,000 ways, they would die. Everyone understood this, accepted it with the fatalism that came naturally to people whose lives were always precarious. On the morning of departure, Floki performed one final ritual. He cut his palm with a knife, let blood drip onto the deck, spoke words in the ancient tongue, asked the gods for protection or acceptance or simply acknowledgement. The few witnesses watching from shore saw him standing with arms raised, saw his lips moving, saw the rain mix with blood and tears on his upturned face. They saw madness, but perhaps they also saw faith, raw and absolute, a devotion that ordinary people could neither achieve nor understand. The ship pulled away from the beach, oars stroking in rhythm, sail catching wind. Floki stood at the stern, looking back at the land growing smaller behind them, this place that had given him shelter and the means to continue his quest. He would never see it again. Ahead lay only water, grey and endless, and somewhere beyond, if the gods were merciful or cruel enough, lay the land he sought, the destination that had become his only purpose, the answer to all his questions, or the end of everything. As the coast disappeared into mist, Floki felt something shift inside him. Fear and hope mixed together until they were indistinguishable, became a single emotion that had no name. He was leaving behind everything certain, sailing toward nothing but possibility and probability of death. It was the most terrifying and the most liberating moment of his life. Behind him lay his crime, his guilt, his failure as a friend and as a man. Ahead lay only the unknown, pure and absolute. In that moment, suspended between past and future, Floki felt almost peaceful. Whatever happened next, at least he would no longer be trapped in the life he had destroyed. At least he would be moving, seeking, acting, rather than merely suffering. At least he would have this one chance to discover if his visions were true, if the gods were real, if meaning existed beyond human construction. The ship rode the waves, moved west, carried a crew of desperate men toward a destination that might not exist, guided by a madman who believed he heard gods whispering directions in the wind. The voyage began in rain that fell for days without pause, a grey curtain that reduced visibility to almost nothing and left everyone soaked and miserable. The crew huddled beneath inadequate shelters, taking turns at the oars, eating cold rations because starting a fire was impossible. Floki stood at the helm, face turned into the wind, water streaming from his hair and beard, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs that only he could interpret. Navigation in the Viking Age was an art more than a science, based on observation and instinct rather than instruments. Sailors watched the sun when it was visible, noted its angle and position to determine direction. They read the waves, understood how swells changed near land, how currents flowed in predictable patterns. They followed birds, knew which species ranged far from shore and which never left sight of land. And they prayed, because ultimately the sea made its own decisions, and all human skill could only work with what the ocean allowed. Floki used all these methods, and others besides. He watched the clouds, claimed to see patterns in their movement that revealed the presence of distant landmasses. He tasted the water, looking for changes in salinity that might indicate freshwater rivers flowing from unseen shores. He listened to the wind, turned his head to catch sounds that might be waves breaking on rocks or beaches miles away. And he consulted his visions, those fragments of insight that came unbidden, showing him images whose meaning was never entirely clear, but which felt true in ways that transcended logic. The crew thought he was mad. They had known this before departure, but out here on the open ocean, surrounded by nothing but water in every direction, his strangeness became even more apparent and more disturbing. He would order course changes for no reason they could see, would suddenly become agitated or calm without external cause, would speak to the sky or the waves as if carrying on conversations. They followed his commands because they had no choice, because they were already committed to this journey, and could only hope that his madness included some element of genuine insight. Days became a week, then 2 weeks. The provisions began to dwindle. The weather improved slightly, the rain stopping, and the sun appearing for brief periods. But the improvement brought its own problems. Now they could see the emptiness around them, the endless expanse of water without any sign of land, without any indication that land even existed in the direction they were traveling. Doubt crept in, grew stronger, became near certainty that they had made a terrible mistake, that they would die out here, that their bones would sink to the ocean floor unseen and unmourned. Floki remained certain, or at least he acted certain, and perhaps there was no difference. He stood at the prow during the day, watching the water, occasionally pointing at things no one else could see, and laughing his high, disturbing laugh. At night, he barely slept, would pace the narrow deck or sit staring at the stars, muttering to himself, sometimes singing in a language that might have been Old Norse or might have been something else entirely. On the 17th day, one of the crew saw birds. They were far from land birds, too small and delicate to range far from shore. Their presence meant land was near, within a day's sailing at most. The sighting brought new energy to the exhausted crew, gave them hope that they might survive after all, that this journey might not end in death and failure. Floki received the news with strange calm, as if he had known all along that this moment would come, as if the discovery was not a relief, but simply confirmation of what had been inevitable. He ordered the sail adjusted, the course modified slightly, following instincts or calculations that remained mysterious to everyone else. And as the sun set that evening, painting the clouds in shades of red and orange, he stood at the rail and spoke a prayer of thanks to gods who might or might not have been listening. The land appeared the next morning, rising from the sea like a vision made solid. Mountains emerged first, dark shapes against the dawn sky. Then gradually the coast became visible, a line of cliffs and beaches, of green lowlands and smoking peaks. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, a place where ice and fire coexisted, where glaciers flowed down to black sand beaches and geysers sent steam billowing into the sky. Iceland, the land that would eventually bear that name, though when Floki first saw it, it had no name in any language, was simply an unmarked space on the mental maps of the Norse, a place of legend now proven real. He had done it, had sailed beyond the known world, and found what he sought. The gods had been true, the visions had been accurate, the madness had contained wisdom after all. The crew shouted with joy and relief, embraced each other, wept. They had survived, had reached land, had accomplished something remarkable. But Floki was silent, his expression difficult to read. Triumph, yes, but mixed with something else. Perhaps the recognition that arrival was not an ending, but a beginning. That finding this land opened questions rather than answering them. That his journey was far from over. They approached the coast cautiously, looking for a safe place to land, a beach where they could bring the ship ashore without damaging it. The shoreline was dramatic but dangerous, steep cliffs alternating with rocky outcroppings, few places where landing seemed possible. They sailed along the coast for hours, searching, until finally they found a fjord, a deep inlet that cut into the land, its waters calm and its shores gently sloped. The ship glided into the fjord like a leaf floating on still water. The crew lowered the sail, took up oars, guided the vessel toward a beach of black sand and smooth stones. The only sounds were the creak of wood, the splash of oars, the distant cry of birds. And then the hull scraped bottom, And they were there, had arrived at the edge of a new world. Floki was the first to step ashore. He walked slowly up the beach, feeling the strange texture of the sand beneath his feet, seeing plants he did not recognize, breathing air that smelled of sulfur and salt and something else, something ancient and powerful. He knelt and placed both hands flat on the ground, closed his eyes, stayed motionless for long minutes, as if listening to the earth itself. When he stood, his face was wet with tears, though whether they were tears of joy or sorrow or something more complicated, none could say. He looked at the mountains rising beyond the shore, at the glaciers gleaming white against the sky, at the steam rising from hot springs in the distance. And he whispered something, words that the wind carried away before anyone could hear them clearly, words that might have been prayer or curse or simple acknowledgement of wonder. The crew spent that first day exploring the immediate area, setting up camp, gathering driftwood for fire, catching fish in the clear, cold water of the fjord. Everything was new and strange. The plants were different from those at home, hardy species adapted to harsh conditions. The birds were unfamiliar, species that had evolved in isolation. Even the stones were unusual, volcanic rock in colors and textures they had never seen. That night, sitting around a fire on a beach at the edge of the world, the crew talked excitedly about what they had found, made plans about exploring further, speculated about riches they might discover. But Floki sat apart, staring into the flames, lost in thoughts he shared with no one. He had found his land, had proven his visions true, had accomplished what he set out to do. But now that it was real, now that the dream had become stone and water and sky, he felt not triumph but emptiness, not satisfaction, but the beginnings of a new and deeper loneliness. The settlement they established was temporary, a collection of crude shelters built from driftwood and turf, barely adequate protection against the wind, but enough to allow them to survive while they explored. Each day, small parties would set out in different directions, mapping the coastline, climbing hills to survey the land, searching for resources that might make permanent habitation possible. Iceland was a study in contrasts, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. There were valleys carpeted with moss so soft it felt like walking on clouds, meadows where wildflowers bloomed in brief, brilliant summers. There were rivers full of salmon, lakes reflecting sky and mountain, hot springs where water bubbled up at temperatures that could cook food or simply provide warmth against the cold. But there were also glaciers that ground stone to powder, volcanoes that could erupt without warning, winter storms that could bury the land in snow for months, darkness that lasted most of the day for half the year. Floki walked the land as if in a trance, touching everything, tasting water from streams, listening to wind through valleys, observing with an intensity that made his companions uncomfortable. He was searching for something, though what exactly remained unclear. Perhaps he sought proof that this land was divinely chosen, marked by the gods as special. Perhaps he was simply trying to understand it, to map not just its physical geography, but its spiritual essence. He found strange things. In one valley, steam rose from cracks in the ground, and the smell of sulfur was so strong it made breathing difficult. The earth there was stained yellow and red, colours that seemed wrong, unnatural. Floki claimed this was a place where the boundary between worlds was thin, where the forces of creation and destruction remained close to the surface. He spent hours there, sitting in the steam, breathing air that should have been poisonous, emerging finally with his eyes distant and his skin flushed, speaking of visions he refused to describe. In another place, they found waterfalls of stunning power, rivers throwing themselves over cliffs to crash hundreds of feet below. The sound was deafening, the spray constant, creating rainbows in the summer sun. Floki stood at the edge, leaning forward as if tempted to jump, letting the mist soak him, shouting words that were lost in the roar. When he finally turned away, he was laughing, that high, strange laugh, and he said something about how the gods liked places where things fell, how descent was as holy as ascent. The crew grew increasingly uneasy. Finding new land was one thing, but living in it was another. This place was harsh, difficult, nothing like the fertile valleys of home. There were no trees large enough for building ships or houses, only stunted birches and willows that grew low to the ground. The growing season was short. The winter would be brutal. Yes, there were fish and birds, hot springs and summer grazing, but was it enough? Could people truly survive here? Or had they discovered a beautiful prison, a land that looked promising, but would slowly kill anyone who tried to make it home? Floki seemed unconcerned with these practical worries. He had found what he sought, had proven the visions true, and that was enough. Or perhaps it was not enough. Perhaps nothing would ever be enough. But he had exhausted his capacity to care about outcomes, had moved beyond practical concerns into a realm where only meaning mattered, where physical survival was less important than spiritual fulfillment. As summer turned toward autumn, the crew began to agitate for departure. They had spent months on the voyage and in exploration, had accomplished what they set out to do, had discovered new land. Now it was time to return, to bring news of their discovery, to claim credit and enjoy the fame that would surely follow. But when they approached Floki with this plan, he refused. He would not leave, he said. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The gods had brought him here for a purpose beyond mere discovery, and he had to stay to understand what that purpose was. The crew could go, he said. Take the ship, sail home, tell Ragnar and everyone else what had been found. He would remain, would spend the winter here, would learn the secrets this land held. The crew was divided. Some wanted to honor Floki's wishes, felt they owed him that much for having led them to this place. Others insisted it was madness, that no one could survive a winter here alone, that Floki was choosing death. The arguments went on for days, voices raised in anger and fear, friendships strained by conflicting loyalties. In the end, a compromise was reached. Most of the crew would return, would take the ship and sail for home before winter made passage impossible. But a few would stay with Floki, volunteers who either believed in his vision or simply felt too guilty to abandon him entirely. 3 men agreed to remain, 3 companions who would share his exile through the dark months ahead. The departure was somber. Those leaving knew they might never see their companions again, knew that winter here could easily claim lives, that the 4 men staying were taking enormous risks. They offered final advice, divided up supplies as fairly as possible, made awkward farewells that could not express the complex mix of guilt and relief and fear they felt. Floki stood on the beach and watched the ship sail away, watched it grow smaller, and then disappear around a headland, leaving him and his 3 companions alone at the edge of the world. The silence after its departure was profound, broken only by wind and waves and the occasional cry of a bird. They were truly isolated now, separated from everything familiar by an ocean that would be impassable for months, committed to survival in a land they barely understood. The 4 men worked hard to prepare. They built better shelters, digging into hillsides and roofing them with turf, creating spaces that would hold heat and provide protection from wind. They gathered as much food as possible, smoke and fish, collecting bird eggs, hunting seals along the coast. They stockpiled driftwood for fire, knowing that fuel would be precious in the months ahead. As the days grew shorter and the cold deepened, Floki became more withdrawn. He would disappear for hours, climbing to high places or walking along the shore, returning exhausted, but offering no explanation of where he had been or what he had been doing. The other 3 learned not to ask, accepted that his mind traveled paths they could not follow, that his relationship with this land was personal and strange. The first snow fell early, covering the ground in white that turned the landscape into something alien and dreamlike. The fjord froze at its edges, ice forming delicate patterns that broke and reformed with the tides. The sun barely rose above the horizon, a brief arc of light that gave little warmth, and the aurora danced almost every clear night, sheets of color flowing across the sky, green and violet and sometimes red, so beautiful it hurt to watch. Floki spent hours watching the northern lights, standing in the freezing cold until his companions had to physically drag him inside lest he die of exposure. He claimed the lights were messages, that the gods spoke through them, that if he watched long enough, he would understand their meaning. What he saw in those shifting curtains of light, what messages he believed he received, he never fully explained. But they changed him, left him even more distant, more lost in his own inner world. The winter was brutal. The cold was deeper than anything they had experienced at home, and it lasted so much longer. The darkness was oppressive, a weight that pressed down on mind and spirit. The wind howled without pause, found every gap in their shelters, made fire difficult to maintain. They ran out of food, had to survive on ever smaller rations, went days with little more than melted snow to fill their bellies. 2 of the 3 companions died during that winter. One simply failed to wake one morning, succumbed to cold or hunger, or the accumulated stress of months of hardship. The other went out during a storm and never returned, his body found days later half buried in snow. Their deaths were quiet, unremarkable, not heroic, but simply sad, the inevitable result of pushing human endurance beyond its limits. Floki and the sole surviving companion buried them as best they could in the frozen ground, spoke prayers over graves that might not last until spring. And then they were just 2 men alone in an empty land, waiting for winter to end, hoping they would have the strength to endure until the sun returned. The darkest part of winter is also the time of greatest clarity, or so Floki believed. When everything external was stripped away, when survival became the only goal and distraction was impossible, then the mind could finally perceive what was always there, but usually hidden by the noise of daily life. The voice of the gods, which had spoken to him in fragments and riddles throughout his life, now came clear and constant, or so he claimed. He spent hours in meditation, sitting in their shelter while the wind howled outside, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and regular. The remaining companion watched with concern, uncertain whether this was wisdom or the final collapse of an already fragile mind. But he said nothing, because what was there to say? They were trapped here until spring made sailing possible again, and how Floki chose to spend the time was his own business as long as it did not threaten their survival. The visions that came to Floki during this period were different from before, more sustained and coherent. He saw the history of this land, or believed he did, watched glaciers advance and retreat over millennia, saw volcanoes build mountains and tear them down again, understood the raw geological forces that had created this place of fire and ice. He saw it as the gods might see it, from outside time, perceiving all moments at once, the deep patterns that human lives were too brief to comprehend. He saw the future, too, or possible futures. He saw ships arriving, more and more of them, bringing settlers who would claim this land and make it their own. He saw farms and villages, children being born, lives being lived in valleys he had walked alone. He saw conflict and cooperation, saw the hard work of building civilization in a place that resisted easy habitation. And he saw himself in these visions, but strangely, as if from a great distance, as if he were already a memory rather than a present reality. What did these visions mean? Were they genuine glimpses of divine knowledge, or were they simply the products of a mind pushed beyond its limits by isolation and hardship? Floki could not say, did not think the question was particularly important. Whether the gods spoke directly, or whether his mind constructed meaning from chaos, made little practical difference. What mattered was that the visions felt true, carried weight and significance, provided a framework for understanding his life and suffering. He came to believe that his crime against Athelstan, terrible as it was, had been necessary to bring him to this place. Not justified, not made right, but necessary in the sense that all events are links in chains of causality that lead somewhere, that serve purposes beyond individual understanding. He had sinned, yes, had committed murder, had betrayed friendship and hospitality. But that sin had driven him into exile, and exile had led him across the ocean, and the ocean had brought him here, to this land, at the edge of the world, where he could finally hear what the gods had been trying to tell him all along. And what was that message? What had all the suffering and searching been for? Floki struggled to articulate it, found that words were inadequate to capture the understanding he believed he had reached. It was something about the necessary relationship between creation and destruction, about how new things could only emerge when old things were torn down. Iceland itself embodied this principle, was a land where volcanic eruptions destroyed and created simultaneously, where glaciers ground rock to sand that became soil for new growth, where the earth itself was still being born. He had built ships that carried his people to new worlds, but he had also destroyed, had taken life, had torn apart the old certainties that once gave him identity and purpose. Both were necessary. Both were part of the same process. The genius and the madness, the creativity and the violence were not opposites, but complementary forces, two sides of the divine power that moved through the world, making and unmaking. This understanding did not bring peace. Understanding rarely does, but it brought a kind of acceptance, a recognition that he was what he was, had done what he had done, and that struggling against these facts was pointless. He was a broken tool in the hands of forces larger than himself, a cracked vessel that nonetheless still held water, still served its purpose, even if that purpose remained mysterious. When spring finally came, when the days began to lengthen and the ice started to melt, Floki and his companion emerged from their shelter to find a world transformed. The snow was receding, revealing ground that steamed as sunlight touched it. Birds returned, filling the air with sound after months of near silence. Streams swelled with meltwater, rushing down from glaciers, bringing life back to the land. They had survived. Barely. Both were thin, weakened by months of inadequate food and the constant stress of cold. But they were alive, had endured the worst that Iceland's winter could offer. And with survival came a return of practical concerns, questions about what to do next, how to move forward, now that the immediate crisis had passed. The companion wanted to leave, to find a way back to Norway, even if it meant building a small boat from the inadequate timber available here. He had seen enough of this land, had paid enough price for Floki's visions. He wanted to go home, to see family, to return to the world of ordinary human concerns. And Floki could not blame him, had no right to ask him to stay longer. But Floki himself wouldn't leave. He had become attached to this place in ways that went beyond rational calculation. This land had broken him and rebuilt him, had stripped him down to essence and shown him truths he could never have discovered in the comfortable familiarity of home. To leave now would be to abandon the only real home he had ever known. The only place where his strangeness made sense, where the voices he heard and the visions he saw felt appropriate to the environment. They argued, but gently, without real anger. Each understood the other's position, even if they could not share it. In the end, they agreed that the companion would attempt to signal passing ships, that sooner or later a vessel must come exploring these waters now that the route had been proven, and when one arrived, he would seek passage home. Floki would stay, would continue his solitary vigil, would live out whatever time remained to him in the land he had discovered. Months passed. The companion built a signal fire on a high point, kept it burning, scanned the horizon for sails that did not come. The summer was brief but intense, the sun barely setting, the land exploding with growth and life after the long death of winter. Floki wandered, explored valleys he had not yet seen, climbed mountains to look out over the vast interior, mapped the coast by walking it for weeks at a time. Finally, a ship did come. Not from Norway seeking them specifically, but explorers following the same route Floki had pioneered, curious about this new land that rumors had begun to speak of. They were surprised to find anyone here, shocked by Floki's appearance and manner, uncertain whether he was a holy man or a madman, or somehow both. The companion left with them, grateful for rescue, eager to return to civilization. He tried one final time to convince Floki to join them, argued that he had done enough, suffered enough, that he could return with honor now, that surely his exile had been served. But Floki refused, shook his head, said he belonged here now, that the gods had not finished with him yet. They left him supplies, what they could spare, though Floki accepted them with little interest. Material things seemed to matter less to him with each passing season, as if he were gradually becoming less physical, more spiritual, transforming into something other than an ordinary man. And then the ship sailed away, and Floki was truly alone, the sole human inhabitant of an entire island, a solitary figure in a vast and empty landscape. He stood on the shore and watched the sail disappear, felt no regret or loneliness, only a strange contentment. This was where he was meant to be, alone with the wind and the waves, the mountains and the glaciers, the voices that spoke from earth and sky. Years passed, though Floki kept no count of them. Time became meaningless when there was no community to mark seasons with shared festivals, no calendar to track days, no social obligations to structure existence. He lived by the sun and the weather, slept when tired, ate when hungry, wandered when the impulse took him. He built a small dwelling in a valley he particularly loved, a place where a hot spring provided warmth and water, where the view stretched across a plain to distant mountains. The structure was crude, barely more than a cave with a door, but it was enough. He needed little, wanted less, had learned that possessions were burdens rather than comforts. His appearance changed dramatically. His hair and beard grew long, turning grey and then white, matted and tangled, because he saw no reason to maintain them. His clothes fell apart and were replaced by garments he made from skins and hides, sewn with bone needles, crude but functional. His hands, once skilled at delicate work, became gnarled and stiff, though they still remembered their craft, still shaped wood when the impulse took him, creating small carvings that he would leave in odd places as gifts to gods, or simply because the act of creation pleased him. He talked to himself constantly, or perhaps he talked to the gods, or perhaps there was no difference. Long conversations about philosophy and memory, about guilt and redemption, about the nature of existence and the meaning of suffering. If anyone had heard these monologues, they would have thought him mad. But there was no one to hear, only wind and stone, which judged nothing and simply listened. Sometimes, in dreams or visions, he saw his old life, saw Ragnar young and ambitious, saw the workshop where he had built his masterpieces, saw Kattegat before everything went wrong. These memories brought neither pleasure nor pain, simply a recognition that he had once been someone different, had lived a life that now seemed almost fictional, as if it had happened to someone else. He thought often of Athelstan. The guilt had faded to something almost comfortable, a constant background presence that no longer demanded attention. He understood now that the murder had been about his own fear and confusion more than about any real threat the monk posed. Athelstan had represented change, the frightening possibility that the old ways were not eternal, that the gods might not be the only truth. Killing him had been an attempt to kill that possibility, to defend a world view that was already crumbling. It had not worked, of course. The Christian god had survived Athelstan's death, had continued to spread across the north, converting people who found its promises more appealing than the harsh demands of the old gods. Floki's crime had changed nothing except his own fate, had exiled him to this lonely place. And perhaps that was justice of a sort, appropriate punishment for someone who had tried to stop the inevitable flow of time and change. But in his isolation, Floki had found something unexpected. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of peace that came from absolute freedom. Here, there were no expectations, no judgments, no need to perform or explain or justify. He could be exactly what he was, a strange old man who heard voices and saw visions, who believed the earth spoke and the sky had moods, who lived halfway between the physical and spiritual worlds. The land itself became his companion. He learned its rhythms, understood its moods, knew when storms were coming days before they arrived. He developed relationships with the animals, the foxes and seabirds, the seals that basked on rocks along the shore. They did not fear him because he posed no threat, existed among them as just another creature, neither predator nor prey, but simply present. Sometimes other people arrived, explorers or settlers, Norse who had followed the route Floki pioneered and come seeking new opportunities. They would find him living in his valley, would be shocked by his appearance and manner, would ask questions about the land and its resources. Floki would answer when the mood struck him, would offer advice about where to settle and what to avoid, would share the knowledge he had accumulated through years of solitary observation. But he would not join them, would not return to living among communities of people. He had moved beyond that, had found in solitude something more valuable than companionship. The settlers would leave him with gifts of food or tools, which he accepted politely but used little. And they would carry back stories about the wild prophet who lived alone in the interior, the mad genius who had discovered Iceland and then refused to claim any credit for it, who lived like a hermit but spoke with the authority of someone who had touched divine truth. As Floki aged, the visions became less frequent but more profound. He would sit by his hot spring for hours, staring at the steam rising into the cold air, and in that steam he would see shapes and patterns that revealed the fundamental structure of reality. Or he would lie on his back watching clouds, and in their movement he would perceive the thoughts of gods, the grand designs that governed all existence. Were these genuine mystical experiences, or simply the hallucinations of an old mind slowly failing? The question seemed less important with each passing year. Floki had long since stopped worrying about the difference between objective reality and subjective experience, had come to understand that human perception was always subjective anyway, that what mattered was not some theoretical truth, but the meaning one constructed from experience. He thought about Ragnar often, wondered if his old friend still lived, still ruled, still dreamed of conquest and glory. He felt no anger about their falling out, no resentment about his exile. Everything had happened as it needed to happen, had brought him to this place where he could finally be himself completely, where the split between his genius and his madness could heal because there was no longer any need to choose between them. In his final years, Floki barely left his valley. The walking that once gave him such pleasure became difficult as his body failed, joints stiffening, muscles weakening, the inevitable decay of age taking its toll. He spent more and more time simply sitting, watching the light change on the mountains, listening to wind and water, existing in a state that was neither meditation nor ordinary consciousness, but something between the two. He carved one last object, his hands shaking with the effort, fingers barely able to grip the knife. It was a small boat, perfect in every detail despite its tiny size, a miniature version of the vessels he had spent his life building. When it was finished, he walked slowly to the shore of a small lake near his dwelling and set it on the water, watched it float away on the gentle current, a final offering to whatever gods or forces had shaped his strange and solitary life. The last winter came, and Floki knew he would not survive it. He was too old, too weak, had pushed his body beyond its limits one too many times. But he felt no fear, only curiosity about what came next, about whether the gods he had served were real, or whether death was simply darkness and silence. He prepared by giving away what little he possessed, leaving tools and furs where settlers might find them, offerings to the living from someone preparing to join the dead. And then he retreated to his dwelling, sealed the door against the coming cold, and lay down to wait. The story of Floki Vilgardarson didn't end with his death, but transformed into something larger, became legend rather than biography, merged with myth until the real man was almost impossible to distinguish from the stories told about him. The settlers who came to Iceland found evidence of his presence, the dwelling where he had lived, carvings he had made, tales passed down from those few who had met him. And from these fragments they constructed a narrative that served their needs, that explained their own presence in this strange land. Floki became, in these stories, a prophet and explorer, the man who discovered Iceland and proved it could sustain human life. His madness was reinterpreted as divine inspiration, his isolation as holy hermitage. The crime that had driven him into exile was forgotten or minimized, became just another part of a complex life, a single mistake in a story full of achievements and insights. The ships he had built were remembered as masterpieces, examples of craft so perfect they seemed almost magical. Sailors would claim to have sailed in vessels Floki made, would speak of how they handled differently from ordinary boats, how they seemed to know the sea in ways human captains didn't. Whether any of these ships actually existed, or whether they had all been destroyed or lost, was irrelevant to the legend. What mattered was the idea of them, the symbol they represented of human genius transcending normal limitations. The real Floki, the man who had struggled with voices in his head, who had murdered a friend out of jealousy and fear, who had died alone in a crude shelter at the edge of the world, was largely forgotten. That man was too complicated, too contradictory, too difficult to fit into the clean narratives people preferred. The legend simplified and ennobled removed the darkness, or reframed it as necessary suffering, made Floki into a hero when the truth was far more ambiguous. But perhaps this is always how legends form, how history transforms into story. The people who came after needed heroes, needed founders who could justify their presence in this difficult land, needed examples of courage and vision to inspire them through their own hardships. Floki, in dying, gave them what they needed, became a figure larger than his actual life, a symbol of the restless human spirit that can never be content with what is, but must always reach toward what might be. The Iceland that emerged in the centuries after Floki's death became one of the great success stories of Viking expansion. Despite its harsh climate and isolation, despite the volcanic eruptions and long winters, people not only survived, but thrived, built a functioning society, created a literary tradition that preserved the old sagas, developed a form of governance that was remarkably democratic for its time. And in all these achievements, Floki's role as discoverer gave him a foundational importance, made him, in some sense, the spiritual father of a new nation. But the legend also preserved something true about the real man, something that transcended the specific facts of his biography. Floki represented the price of genius, the cost of vision, the necessary connection between creativity and madness. His story reminded people that great achievements often come from individuals who do not quite fit, who see the world differently, who are willing to pay terrible personal prices for their gifts and their dreams. The ships he built, or the idea of the ships he built, became symbols of possibility, of the human capacity to cross boundaries and reach new worlds. Every vessel that sailed from Iceland to Greenland or to the shores of North America carried with it the legacy of Floki's craft, the knowledge he had pioneered, the spirit of exploration he embodied. The literal ships might have rotted away, but their influence persisted, shaped the entire trajectory of Norse exploration and expansion. And his madness, reinterpreted as spiritual sensitivity, reminded people that the boundary between human and divine was permeable, that some individuals could touch powers beyond ordinary perception. The Norse worldview, with its belief in active gods and living landscape, found in Floki's visions confirmation of what they already believed, proof that their religion wasn't mere superstition, but genuine contact with forces that shaped reality. The modern observer, looking back across centuries, might try to diagnose Floki to fit him into categories defined by contemporary psychology. Schizophrenia, perhaps, or some form of bipolar disorder, conditions that would explain the voices and the visions, the mood swings and the isolation. But such diagnoses, while possibly accurate in clinical terms, would miss something essential about who Floki was and what his life meant. He lived in a different world, operated according to different assumptions about reality. In his context, the visions were not symptoms of illness, but potential messages from gods. The voices were not hallucinations, but communications from a spiritual realm that everyone believed existed. His behavior, strange as it might seem to modern eyes, made sense within the framework of Norse cosmology and culture. And perhaps most importantly, Floki's madness and his genius were inseparable. The same sensitivity that allowed him to build perfect ships also opened him to visions. The same obsession that drove him to murder also drove him across the ocean to discover new lands. He was not a well man who happened to be talented, but someone whose talent and illness were woven together, could not exist separately. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of creativity and the cost we are willing to accept for exceptional achievement. Would Floki have been better off if he had been more normal, more stable, more capable of ordinary human happiness? Perhaps he would have lived longer, maintained friendships, avoided the guilt and exile that marked his later years. But he also would not have built the ships that changed history, would not have discovered Iceland, would not have become the figure whose story has persisted for more than 1,000 years. The story of Floki is ultimately a story about the human condition, about the ways we are divided within ourselves, about the tension between what we want and what we are capable of, between the lives we might have lived and the ones we actually do. It is a story about the loneliness of genius, the necessity of madness, the terrible beauty that comes when a human mind pushes beyond normal boundaries and touches something greater and more dangerous than ordinary consciousness. As night falls over the North Atlantic, over the island Floki discovered and the waters he crossed, the wind still carries whispers that might be his voice, or might be simply the sound of air moving through stone and water. The northern lights still dance in winter skies, painting colors that seem to reveal hidden meanings, speaking in a language that only certain people can almost understand. And somewhere in the mountains of Iceland, in a valley where a hot spring still steams and the view stretches to distant glaciers, there stands a crude stone structure, barely more than ruins now, where a strange old man once lived alone and believed he heard gods speaking. The story ends where it began, in mystery and ambiguity, with questions that have no clear answers. Was Floki mad or blessed? Were his visions real or imagined? Did his suffering have meaning, or was it simply tragedy? Each person must decide for themselves, must weigh the evidence and make their own judgment about what his life represents and what lessons, if any, it offers. But this much is certain. Floki lived, built, discovered, suffered, and died. He changed the world in ways both large and small, opened new possibilities for his people, paid terrible prices for his gifts. He was human in all his contradictions, divine in his aspirations, broken in his limitations. He was a genius and a madman, a builder and a destroyer, a friend and a murderer, a prophet and a fool. And in the end, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any of us are, collections of contradictions trying to make meaning from chaos, seeking purpose in a world that offers none except what we construct ourselves. Floki's construction was ships and discoveries, visions and crimes, a life lived with absolute intensity, even when that intensity brought pain. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and the demands of day fade into memory, we have walked beside this strange and solitary man, seen through his eyes the forests and shores, the storms and visions that shaped his existence. We have felt his genius and his madness, his faith and his doubt, his achievements and his crimes. And perhaps, in following his journey, we have learned something about our own, about the prices we pay for our dreams, about the fine line between inspiration and obsession, about what it means to reach beyond the known toward mysteries that may destroy us, but which we cannot help but pursue. The story of Floki, the mad genius of the north, ends here, in the silence of Iceland's mountains and the whisper of wind over water. But the questions his life raises continue, echo down through centuries, touch everyone who hears his story and wonders what they might be willing to sacrifice, what madness they might embrace, what seas they might cross in pursuit of visions that may or may not be real, but which call to them nonetheless, with voices impossible to ignore. Sleep well, and let the story drift through your dreams like ships across dark water, carrying meaning you cannot quite grasp, but which feels somehow important, necessary, true.